Howdy, folks. It's me again, Randy Ray, the Literate Texan, and I am coming to you pre-recorded again from Driftwood Ranch with my Horror Mayhem 2023 starter post, introduction post. I'm not really one of the co-hosts of this event, so I can't really say this is an announcement. I guess it's an announcement for folks. Anyway, Horror Mayhem this year. Here's what I understand we're doing. We're reading shorter works of horror, and we're shooting for less than 250 words. And the emphasis is on possibly short stories for Horror Mayhem 2023. So I've put together a tentative to-be read list because I really want to participate in this one. I might have mentioned in a previous video that you didn't see that I used to own an all horror bookstore in Texas called Erie Books. And in the comments, I will leave a link to an interview I did with NBC DFW. And sadly, they took the video down of me being interviewed, but it's not too different from these videos. It's just I had longer hair then. I looked a little bit like Benjamin Franklin because I had Benjamin Franklin eyeglasses then too. And I was younger because I opened that bookstore in 2008. I believe it was open until 2012. But horror, the funny thing is I don't read a lot of horror anymore. So it'll be nice to get back to it. And I've decided to focus on short story collections that I already own. I have 5 picked out for Horror Mayhem 2023. And in no particular order, I'm going to show them to you. The first is Saturday, which is a collection of short stories from Harlan Ellison. And if you look up Harlan Ellison, in this book in particular, in the Wikipedia, it's categorized as speculative fiction. I have not read all the stories in here, although I've read some of the stories in here. I think everybody's read Jeff D is 5. I've also read All the Lies That Are My Life. And the other one in here, Saturday, was a great episode of the 1980s version of The Twilight Zone that starred Bruce Willis, who was wonderful in it. And I believe that might have been the first or second episode. Harlan Ellison was a creative consultant for that version of The Twilight Zone, which as a teenager, I just loved because I'd grown up watching the black and white editions of The Twilight Zone that Rod Serling had hosted. And my local convenience store, which was not a 7-Eleven, I grew up in a small town in Texas, was called Woody's Superette. And Woody's Superette carried Twilight Zone magazine, which, and correct me if I'm wrong and you know better, was edited by Dennis Etchison, who is a wonderful writer of short stories. And I had the good fortune of interviewing him at one point via email for a biography I'd written for my Erie Books website a long time ago. Anyway, may he rest in peace. He was a really nice guy via email. Also, I got a letter from Harlan Ellison when I was in college, and it was really cool. And sadly, it's one of the belongings that I had and no longer possess. But he was just as surly and grumpy and interesting in a letter as he was in his fiction. So, I don't know. Some people don't like Harlan Ellison. It's easy to see through his shtick now that I'm older. He clearly had short man syndrome. He clearly had a huge ego, incredibly opinionated. But man, the guy had a knack for titles. I mean, there's no getting around that. I mean, The City on the Edge of Forever. That's a good title, man. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. That's a great title too, man. So anyway, when I read about this book, it said that it was mostly about the horror of human frailty. So I have a feeling there might be some creepy, scary stuff in here. And if I read the first 3 or 4 stories and I realize that it's not horror enough, I'll DNF it. Or maybe not. I tend to enjoy reading Harlan Ellison, although I don't think he's the literary giant that maybe he thought he was. Shouldn't speak ill of the dead. But I really liked Harlan Ellison. And still like Harlan Ellison. I really enjoyed his movie reviews for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction when I was growing up too. Next, number 2 on my list of books for Horror Mayhem 2023 this is really cool. So I'm on a kind of a nostalgia trip because I'm getting older and I have a chronic illness. So, I don't know how long I have left to live. So I'm reliving some of the fun stuff that I read when I was much younger. And my mom had a book that I never finished. I just skip around in it, called The Ghouls. And I believe the editor of this, Peter Haining, that's what he did, was he edited books. He curated short stories for collections on various subjects. It wasn't always about scary movies. But The Ghouls is a collection of 19 short stories, all of which were made into films. One of the weird things about it, and I've never forgotten this, is that he would opt to go with the movie's name, even if the movie's name wasn't the same as the name of the short story. And one of the examples here, which will be familiar to a lot of my readers if they're familiar with horror at all, was an H.P. Lovecraft story called The Color Out of Space, which is one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. But the movie that was made out of it at the time was called Monster of Terror. And that's how it's listed in the table of contents here. So that's kind of weird. But this has got some cool stuff in it. It's got everything from Edgar Allan Poe to Nathaniel Hawthorne to Bram Stoker, Robert Louis Stevenson, Robert Bloch. The introduction is by Vincent Price and the afterword is by Christopher Lee. I sometimes wonder about stuff like this. This was published in 1971. And of course, if you're writing a book of stories or editing a book of stories about, stories that were made into horror movies, naturally you would want Vincent Price to write your introduction and Christopher Lee to write your afterword. But did they really write it or were those ghostwritten? Because I know my mom had a huge collection of Alfred Hitchcock books. Alfred Hitchcock presents stories that scared even me. And I know Hitchcock had nothing to do with those. He just licensed them his name and image. So, is this really an introduction from Vincent Price? Well, maybe, I don't know. Doesn't matter. The stories in here are cool. I love the cover art on this book. It reminds me of my mom. The only thing I don't like about this, there's a little bit of fox in here. Actually, there's a lot of fox in here. It's published in 1971. It's a 50-year-old book. It's kind of hard to find, to tell you the truth. So I can't complain about that. These other two, this is going to be the first time I've whipped out my my Kindle on screen here. But these other two, and I've got 5 books picked out actually. But the first one I want to show you here is Everything's Eventual. It's a collection of Stephen King short stories. And I guess what I heard was, if you want to show somebody the cover on one of these, you can't do it straight because it won't show. But anyway, Everything's Eventual was a 2002 collection of short stories from Stephen King. It has 14 stories in there. I understand 11 of them are short stories and 3 of them are novellas, but I'm not the kind of guy that get hung up on that, believe you me. 1408, which was made into a movie with John Cusack. Good movie, I thought. Is one of the stories in here. I've read this before. I don't remember it. Maybe I didn't read it. But if it was published in 2002, that was in the middle of my drinking career. So it's very possible I didn't remember it. I could have read it and not remembered it. The other one that I have here, forgive me, it's going to take me a second, is The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. And this was published in 1895. It's got 10 stories in it. My understanding is the first 4 stories have to do with The King in Yellow, which concerns a play that drives people crazy who see it. And it's not a Cthulhu Mythos tale because it came out, 30 years before Lovecraft started publishing these things. My mouth's a little dry because of my medication, so excuse me, I'm gonna take a sip of Coke. Sorry about that. So, anyway, never read these, but I know that Lovecraft borrowed some of the stuff from it. And Lovecraft also borrowed the idea of having an element of his fiction that appeared repeatedly throughout his stories, but that weren't fully explained, like the Necronomicon. Lovecraft never wrote the book, The Necronomicon, but it features in several of his stories. And, there are elder gods whose names pop up from time to time throughout H.P. Lovecraft's fiction about the Cthulhu mythos, but they're never fully explained either. It was just part of creating, some of it was just in fun, I think. But anyway, I'm looking forward to digging into that. But I understand the 6 subsequent stories in the book are not necessarily set in this King of Yellow universe. So, and they're not even necessarily horror stories. So I don't know how many of those I'm going to read or not read. You know what I mean? I guess it depends on whether or not I like them. And, okay, so that is a total of 59 short stories for May, which is plenty. But just in case, I do have the horror stories of Robert E. Howard. And I feel like if I were going to read a horror story all the way through for a video on YouTube or on BookTube, it would be appropriate to read one of these because Robert E. Howard is from the piney woods of East Texas, just like me. So I would imagine he talked a little bit like me. I don't know. I never heard him speak. But I am from East Texas also. So, and I've been told I have a distinctive accent. I think I sound like the man on the 6 o'clock news. Go figure. Anyway, this one's a doozy because it was published in 2008, although most of the stories are probably from the 20s. But there are 61 stories listed in the table of contents. Now, some of those stories aren't really stories, okay? I glanced through it. There's at least 4 fragments of stories in there, so they're not very long. And there are several poems in there. And one of the poems was only 4 lines long, and they weren't long lines either. So I don't know that this is as huge and as intimidating as it seems, but, it is 500 pages. I mean, it's a long book. So, I might read some of the stories, but not all of them. I have read Pigeons from Hell, which is one of his more famous works. And, of course, you got to remember, this is a guy from the 1920s who lived in the piney woods of East Texas. Some of his attitudes about race and gender are reflective of that time. So, I don't know what the appropriateness editors are doing after they finish with James Bond. Maybe they'll take a hack at Robert E. Howard. Or maybe they'll go get in touch with Cormac McCarthy and add some punctuation to some of his stories. I stole that joke, but I can't remember from whom. So anyway, that's my plan for Horror Mayhem 2023. I'm real excited about it. I'm also excited about Juno on the Range, which I participated in sort of last year. I wasn't making YouTube videos at the time, but I was putting post-ups on Instagram. I will put some links in the comments because, of course, I know about Horror Mayhem 2023 because of people like Steve Donahue, Michael K. Vaughn, and there are a couple more. I'm going to look them up in my viewing history so that I don't leave anybody out. Yeah, so that'll be in the comments. There will also be a link to an interview with yours truly from back in the day when I owned a bookstore. And the best quote in the interview with me is, "I'm just trying to do my part to keep America literate, man." So anyway, if you watched the whole video, I sure am grateful for you. And I'm sorry I hadn't posted anything in a couple weeks. My health is kind of iffy these days. So, I'm going to try to be more consistent about posting videos, regardless of how I feel. But, man, I can't promise anything. So, this health battle's a trip. But it's also really underlined in red what Steve Donahue always points out. Your reading time is precious because you've only got so much of it. And that is more apparent to me every single day now. So, but that's the subject for another video that's not really very bookish unless we're talking about, books about health, which I like to read too. But anyway, I'm not going to get into all that. I wanted to make a Horror Mayhem 2023 video. I'm on medication today that makes me ramble. There'll probably be some more videos tonight. Hope that's okay. Talk to you soon, BookTube.